Under the scorching August sun of 1847, Ada Whitlow lay frozen against the burning sand, her 22-year-old body pressed motionless beneath 6 feet of coiled diamondback rattlesnake. The serpent's muscular form wrapped around her torso like living rope. Its massive triangular head positioned mere inches from her throat, black tongue flicking out to taste her fear-soaked sweat. Each shallow breath she managed to draw caused the creature's scales to shift against her ribs, a sensation like sandpaper dragged across raw skin. The desert stretched endlessly in all directions, a hellscape of saguaro cacti, casting knife-blade shadows, sun-bleached animal bones scattered across alkali flats, and heat waves that made the distant mountains dance like mirages. Somewhere in that vast emptiness, a roadrunner called once and fell silent, as if sensing the deadly tableau unfolding among the creosote bushes and barrel cacti. "Mighty fine pickle you've gotten yourself into, ain't it, darlin'?" The voice belonged to Jed Kincaid, 34 years old and meaner than a stepped-on sidewinder. He stood just beyond the snake's striking distance, his leather duster hanging open to reveal the pearl-handled Colt at his hip. Tobacco juice stained the corners of his mouth, and his pale blue eyes held the cold amusement of a cat watching a mouse in a trap. "That there's what we call a desert diamondback, biggest I've seen in 10 years of riding this country. Must be carrying enough venom to drop 3 horses. Ada's heart hammered against her ribs so violently she feared it might trigger the snake to strike. Every muscle in her body screamed to run, to fight, to do anything but lie still while death coiled around her chest. But buried deep in her memory was her father's voice, steady and calm, during a lesson given when she was barely 16. "When a rattler's got you dead to rights, Ada girl, moving fast is what kills you. They strike at motion, at heat, at the smell of panic sweat. But if you can master your fear, breathe shallow and slow, sometimes, just sometimes, they'll lose interest and slither away to find easier prey." The irony wasn't lost on her. Samuel Whitlow had taught her that lesson while treating a viper bite on their neighbor's dog, showing her how to milk venom from the severed head for antidote purposes. "Nature's got its own balance," he'd explained, carefully extracting the yellowish poison drop by drop. "What can kill can also cure if you know how to use it proper." Now, 3 days after fleeing the nightmare that her life had become, Ada found herself testing every survival skill her father had ever taught her, while the man who destroyed her future watched with undisguised pleasure. The chain of events that had led to this moment began 6 months earlier, when consumption finally claimed Samuel Whitlow, after a 2-year battle that left him gaunt as a scarecrow, but still determined to prepare his daughter for a harsh world. Ada had nursed him through those final weeks, learning his last lessons about desert survival animal behavior and the kind of practical knowledge that kept frontier families alive. "The desert don't care about your troubles." Samuel had wheezed during one of their last walks together, pointing out the subtle signs that marked a reliable water source. "But it rewards those who pay attention, who learn its moods and respect its power. Remember that, Ada girl. Sometimes the very thing that threatens you can become your salvation." After the funeral, Ada's world crumbled with devastating swiftness. Her mother, Martha, overwhelmed by widowhood and the brutal isolation of frontier life, sought comfort first in laudanum, then in the arms of Cyrus Bellwether, a weak-chinned gambler who saw marriage to Samuel's widow as a ticket to respectability and property ownership. Within 3 months, Martha was dead of an overdose, leaving Ada alone with a stepfather whose debts far exceeded his conscience. The end came on a sweltering July morning when Cyrus returned from Tucson with bloodshot eyes and trembling hands. "We got us a problem, Ada," he'd mumbled, unable to meet her gaze. "I owe money to some dangerous men. More money than we got. Then sell the ranch." Ada had replied, though the thought of losing her father's legacy cut like a knife. "Start over somewhere else." Cyrus laughed bitterly. Ranch ain't worth half what I owe, but there's another way to settle the debt." His voice dropped to a whisper. "Jed Kincaid's willing to call it even in exchange for your hand in marriage." The name hit Ada like a physical blow. Everyone in the territory knew about Jed Kincaid, the outlaw who controlled smuggling routes from Tucson to El Paso, whose gang terrorized isolated settlements, whose reputation for casual violence made hardened lawmen cross themselves at the mention of his name. He was said to have beaten a man to death with his bare hands for looking at his cards during a poker game, to have burned out entire families for the sport of it. "I won't do it," Ada had said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "I'd rather die than marry that monster." "Then we'll both die." Cyrus snapped desperation, making him cruel. "Kincaid don't take kindly to being refused. He'll kill us both and take you anyway." But Ada had underestimated her stepfather's cowardice. The next morning, she woke to find Jed Kincaid sitting at their kitchen table drinking coffee from her mother's china as if he owned the place. He was smaller than his reputation suggested, perhaps 5'10" in his boots, but there was something reptilian in the way he moved, a predatory stillness that made Ada's skin crawl. "Morning bride-to-be." He'd said, his voice soft as silk and twice as dangerous. "Pretty little thing, ain't you gonna clean up real nice?" The wedding was set for the following week. Jed explained his terms with the casual cruelty of a man accustomed to absolute obedience. Ida would bear his children, maintain his household, and never question his authority. In return, he might refrain from beating her too severely, provided she proved sufficiently entertaining. "See, I got a reputation to maintain." He'd continued lighting a hand-rolled cigarette with practiced ease. "Men in my line of work, they respect strength. Having a pretty wife who knows her place, that's a sign of strength. Shows I can take what I want and keep it." That night, while Jed celebrated his acquisition with Cyrus over a bottle of rot-gut whiskey, Ada made her choice. She packed light water jerky, her father's old Spencer rifle, and the small vial of snake venom Samuel had taught her to extract years ago, kept for emergencies that had never come. Then she saddled Dusty, her father's steady Mustang, and rode into the desert darkness. For 3 days, she'd pushed hard across the Sonoran wasteland, following game trails and dry creek beds toward the mining camps near the Mexican border. She'd rationed her water, carefully traveled by night when possible, and used every trick Samuel had taught her about reading the desert's moods. But Jed had been relentless in his pursuit, and this morning her horse had finally collapsed from exhaustion just as she spotted the dust cloud that meant her time had run out. Ada's legs buckled as she scrambled up a steep ridge of red sandstone, 3 days of flight and minimal water finally taking their toll. She tumbled down the far side in a cascade of loose rock and thorny ocotillo branches, coming to rest in a natural bowl surrounded by barrel cacti and the bleached bones of long-dead cattle. Her torn dress caught on every thorn, and her water was nearly gone, perhaps half a canteen left, barely enough for another day if she was careful. Through the heat shimmer, she watched Jed approach on his big bay stallion, sitting easy in the saddle, with the confidence of a man who'd never doubted the outcome of this chase. He'd left his men behind, she realized, probably wanted the pleasure of recapturing his runaway bride all to himself. 3 days, he called out as he dismounted, his spurs chiming softly with each step. 3 days you led me through this godforsaken country, following your daddy's old Indian trails like you thought you could outsmart me. He paused to spit tobacco juice into the sand, his pale eyes never leaving her face. Made me look like a fool in front of my boys, having to chase after one little girl. Ada tried to push herself upright, but her strength was gone. The desert sun had burned her fair skin to leather, and her lips were cracked and bleeding from dehydration. Every breath felt like swallowing fire. "Please," she whispered the word, barely audible. "Just let me go. I'll disappear. You'll never..." "Never what?" Jed's laughter was harsh as a buzzard's cry. Never make me look weak again. Never show every two-bit outlaw from here to California that Jed Kincaid can't keep his own woman in line. He shook his head slowly. No, darling. Time for an object lesson, and this desert's fixin' to be your classroom. That's when Ada heard it, the distinctive warning buzz of an agitated rattlesnake coming from somewhere very close behind her. She froze instantly, every nerve in her body going rigid as Samuel's teachings flooded back. Rattlers give warning because they'd rather save their venom for prey they can actually eat. But if you threaten their territory, if you make them feel cornered, they'll strike faster than lightning and twice as deadly. Jed heard the warning too, and his expression shifted from cruel amusement to predatory interest as he spotted the snake's den among the rocks. Well, I'll be damned, he said, uncoiling his braided leather whip from his belt. Looks like the desert's about to save me some trouble. Always did prefer letting natural causes handle my problems, keeps the law off my back. He began to circle her slowly, deliberately, keeping the snake agitated with his movement and the metallic jingle of his spurs. You know what your problem is, Ada Whitlow. Your daddy filled your head with notions about being independent, about making your own choices in a man's world. Time to learn different, too. The whip cracked like a gunshot, striking the rocks just inches from the snake's den. Immediately, the buzzing intensified, and Ada felt movement behind her scales, sliding over stone, getting closer. Her mouth went dry with terror that had nothing to do with thirst. Come on out, you ornery bastard, Jed crooned to the serpent, raising the whip again. Time to meet your new friend. Ada's mind raced through everything Samuel had taught her about desert predators. Diamondbacks were ambush hunters by nature, preferring to remain hidden and strike from concealment. But when defending their territory, they would emerge to face threats directly coiling in a defensive posture with head raised and ready to strike. The snake's behavior was predictable. It was Jed's that terrified her. The whip snapped again this time, scraping across the entrance to the den. The rattling reached a fever pitch, and suddenly Ada felt the snake brush against her leg as it emerged from its rocky shelter. The contact was electric, warm scales, powerful muscle, and underneath it all the terrible promise of venom that could kill her in agony. Don't move, she commanded herself, fighting every instinct that screamed at her to run. Shallow breath, slow heartbeat be part of the desert floor. But her heart was hammering so hard she could hear blood rushing in her ears, and sweat stung the countless small cuts left by cactus spines. That's it, Jed encouraged, as the snake emerged fully and began to explore this new element in its territory. Get acquainted with the lady. She's been mighty eager to make your acquaintance. The diamondback was magnificent and terrible, easily 6 feet long, its diamond-patterned hide perfect desert camouflage. Ada could see the small, heat-sensing pits between its eyes and nostrils, evolutionary marvels that could detect the warmth of a mouse from 6 feet away. Right now, those sensors were focused on her, reading the rapid pulse of blood beneath her skin, the elevated temperature that marked her as either prey or threat. Be neither, she told herself, remembering another of Samuel's lessons. A rattlesnake don't want to waste venom on something too big to eat. If you can convince it you're just part of the landscape, a warm rock, a dead log, sometimes it'll move on to easier hunting. But Jed wasn't about to let the snake lose interest. He began pacing back and forth, his boots crunching on gravel, the whip trailing behind him like a leather serpent. Every few steps he'd crack it in the air, keeping both Ada and the snake on edge. What happened next would be seared into Ada's memory forever. The diamondback, increasingly agitated by Jed's harassment and confused by Ada's unnatural stillness, suddenly surged forward and coiled around her torso in what she realized was a defensive maneuver. The snake wasn't trying to constrict her. It was using her body as a living shield while positioning itself to strike at the real threat. The weight was incredible, like wearing a vest made of living muscle and bone. The snake's scales rasped against the fabric of her dress, and she could feel its powerful heartbeat through its body, rapid and strong, a rhythm of pure, primitive fear that matched her own. Its massive triangular head came to rest just below her collarbone, and she could feel its breath on her throat, warm and alien and deadly. Jesus H. Christ. Jed breathed momentarily, taken aback by the sight. But his surprise lasted only seconds before transforming into savage delight. "Well, ain't that something? Look like you found yourself a dance partner, darlin'." Ada bit her lip to keep from screaming as the snake adjusted its position, its coils tightening slightly around her ribs. She could feel the individual scales now, each one a tiny armor plate, warmed by the desert sun. The creature's head swayed slightly as it tracked Jed's movement, and she caught a glimpse of the curved fangs folded back against its palate, ivory needles that could punch through leather and inject enough venom to kill a grown man. "Breathe," she reminded herself. "Slow and shallow. Let it know you're not the enemy." But every breath was a conscious effort now, with the snake's weight pressing against her chest and the certain knowledge that one wrong move would trigger a strike that would end everything. Jed resumed his taunting patrol, clearly enjoying himself. "You know what's gonna happen now, don't you, girl? That snake's gonna get tired of holding still. Maybe a bird'll fly overhead, maybe a lizard'll skitter past, and when it does..." He made a striking motion with his hand. "Faster than you can blink, those fangs are gonna pump enough poison into you to kill a buffalo." Minutes stretched like hours under the relentless sun. Ada's back began to ache from lying motionless on the uneven ground, and the snake's weight made each breath a struggle. Sweat ran into her eyes, stinging and blurring her vision. Her left arm, trapped beneath the snake's coils, was going numb, and she had to resist the maddening urge to shift position. Through it all, Jed kept up his verbal assault, describing in vivid detail how diamondback venom would course through her system. "First you'll feel the fire," he said conversationally, as if discussing the weather. "Like liquid flame racing up your arm toward your heart. Then comes the swelling, your throat'll close up, your tongue'll swell till you can't even scream. And finally," he smiled, "finally you'll drown in your own fluids as your lungs fill up with blood." But as the afternoon wore on and shadows began to lengthen across the desert floor, Ada noticed something that sent a spark of hope through her despair. The snake's grip around her torso was gradually loosening. Its head, while still poised to strike, had begun to turn away from Jed to scan the surrounding terrain for escape routes. The creature was starting to realize that the motionless woman beneath it posed no threat, which meant it was looking for a way to disengage from this confrontation entirely. Now or never, she thought, remembering another piece of her father's wisdom. Sometimes the only way out of a trap is to spring it yourself on your own terms when your enemy least expects it. She began to shift her weight with infinite care, so gradually that the movement was almost imperceptible. Her right hand crept toward the snake's tail, where it lay coiled near her hip. The scales felt like warm leather against her palm, and she could feel the incredible strength coiled within the creature's body. Jed, drunk on his own power and convinced of Ada's helplessness, took a step closer than he'd dared before. He wanted to see the despair in her eyes, to savor the moment of her complete defeat. "Won't be long now," he murmured, leaning down until his face was just 3 feet from hers. "I can see it in your eyes, you're starting to break." That's when Ada struck. With one fluid motion born of desperation and her father's training, Ada grasped the snake's tail and flung the startled creature directly at Jed's face. The diamondback, caught completely off guard by this sudden attack, reacted with pure predatory instinct. It struck with every ounce of venom in its system. Jed stumbled backward, raising his whip hand defensively, but the snake's needle-sharp fangs punched through his leather sleeve and buried themselves deep in the meat of his forearm. He screamed a sound of pure animal terror that echoed off the surrounding rocks and tried to shake the serpent loose. But diamondbacks hold on when they strike, ensuring their venom gets pumped deep into the victim's bloodstream. "Get it off!" Jed shrieked, stumbling and falling backward into a patch of prickly pear cactus. "Get it off me!" The snake released its grip and dropped to the ground, immediately coiling for another strike. But Ada was already moving, rolling away from the confrontation and scrambling to her feet on legs that shook like a newborn colt's. For the first time in 3 days, she was free. And Jed Kincaid was the one in mortal danger. He managed to draw his revolver with his uninjured hand, but the gun wavered wildly as the venom began its work. Twin puncture wounds on his forearm already showed the telltale darkening of injected poison, and his face had gone pale as parchment. "You crazy bitch," he gasped, clutching his wounded arm against his chest. "You goddamn crazy." The words died as fire began to race up his arm toward his shoulder, just as he described it happening to Ada moments before. She had perhaps minutes before the venom rendered him unconscious, or before his approaching men heard his screams and came running. The irony wasn't lost on her. Jed had tried to use the desert's dangers against her, and now those same dangers had turned in his favor. But Ada's victory was short-lived. Even as Jed writhed in pain, fighting the spreading effects of the venom, the sound of his screams carried far across the desert silence. In the distance, she could hear voices calling back and forth, his men riding hard toward the commotion. "My boys." Jed managed to gasp through gritted teeth, sweat beading on his forehead as the venom worked its way through his system. 5 of the meanest bastards ever rode the frontier. They'll be here in minutes. Ada's mind raced. She was still weak from 3 days of flight, her water nearly gone, and she had no weapon except the small folding knife in her boot. Even if she could overpower Jed in his weakened state, his men would run her down before she could get far on foot across the open desert. But Samuel had taught her more than just how to survive. He'd taught her how to think like the desert itself, patient and ruthless, and utterly without mercy when survival was at stake. Her eyes fell on Jed's canteen dropped during his encounter with the snake and lying half-buried in the sand. Then she looked at the diamondback, now coiled defensively near a cluster of barrel cacti, and remembered another of her father's lessons from years past. The venom don't die when the snake does. Samuel had explained while treating that neighbor's dog bite. Stays potent for hours, sometimes days, if you know how to extract it proper. That's why the old Apache warriors would coat their arrowheads with poison from dead snakes worked just as well as the fresh stuff. The sound of approaching hoofbeats was getting closer. Ada could make out individual voices, now rough men calling to each other across the wasteland. She had perhaps 2 minutes before they crested the ridge and saw the scene below. Working quickly, she retrieved Jed's canteen and shook it nearly full enough water for 5 men who'd been riding hard in the desert heat. Then she used her father's knife to sever the snake's head, careful to avoid the still deadly fangs that could inject venom even in death. "What are you doing?" Jed whispered, his voice already slurred by the toxin spreading through his bloodstream. "What are you—" Ada didn't answer. With practiced movements learned long ago, she pressed the severed head against the canteen's opening, allowing the remaining venom to drip into Jed's water supply. The poison was thick and yellowish, like tree sap, and she could see it swirling in the clear water like liquid death. The first rider appeared on the ridge just as Ada finished her grisly work and melted into the maze of boulders that marked the beginning of a deep arroyo. From her hiding place among the rocks, she could see 5 hard-faced men dismounting and gathering around their fallen leader. She recognized the type saddle tramps and gunfighters drawn to Jed's gang by easy money and fewer questions. They were already arguing about what to do, some wanting to pursue Ada immediately, while others insisted on tending to Jed's wound first. "A boss got himself snake bit." She heard one of them say, a bearded man with a scar running from his left ear to his mouth. Arms swelling up something fierce. "Where's the girl?" Another demanded, scanning the surrounding rocks with nervous eyes. "Don't matter," the scarred man replied, grabbing Jed's canteen. "We find her after we get some water in us. Been riding hard for hours in this heat." He took a long drink and passed the canteen around. Within minutes, all 5 men had drunk deeply from the poisoned water, their throats parched from the desert chase. Ada watched in grim satisfaction as her father's lesson played out before her eyes. The venom worked more slowly when ingested rather than injected, but it was just as deadly. The first man to collapse was the youngest, barely 18, probably someone's son drawn to outlaw life by dreams of easy wealth. He clutched his stomach and began retching violently into the sand. Something's wrong. Another gasped, his face going gray. The water. Something's wrong with the water. Panic spread through the group as more men began showing symptoms. They turned on each other with accusations and drawn guns, but the poison was already in their systems, working its way through their bloodstreams like liquid fire. Jed, barely conscious now, tried to warn them about the contaminated water, but his words came out as incoherent mumbles. His men ignored him, focused on their own rapidly deteriorating condition. By sunset, 3 of the 5 lay motionless in the sand. The remaining 2 were in no condition to pursue anyone barely able to stay upright in their saddles as they tried to get Jed to a doctor. But the nearest town was 50 miles away, and Jed was already deep in the grip of venom-induced delirium. Ada emerged from her rocky shelter as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky. The desert night brought blessed coolness after the brutal heat of the day, and she knew that traveling in darkness would give her the best chance of reaching safety. She approached the scene of carnage, carefully ready to dive for cover if any of Jed's men still posed a threat. But the poison had done its work thoroughly. 3 men lay dead, another was unconscious and dying, and the 5th was barely able to sit his horse as he tried to keep Jed from falling from the saddle. "Please," the surviving outlaw croaked as he saw her emerge from the shadows. "Help us. You need to ride," Ada said quietly, her voice steady despite the adrenaline still coursing through her veins. "Take him and go. If I see you again, I'll kill you both." The man needed no further encouragement. He managed to get Jed's semi-conscious form secured to his horse, then headed north toward Tucson, swaying in the saddle like a drunk man. Ada watched them disappear into the darkness, knowing she'd probably never see either of them alive again. The desert was unforgiving to the weak and wounded, and both men were carrying enough venom in their systems to drop an ox. She gathered what supplies she could from the dead men, water, ammunition, jerky, and a spare horse that seemed gentle enough for a woman to handle. Then she mounted up and rode south toward the Mexican border, following the North Star, just as her father had taught her. 2 years later, Ada Whitlow had become something of a legend in the mining camps and frontier settlements of southern Arizona. She'd settled in the thriving town of Esperanza Wells, where her knowledge of desert survival made her invaluable as a guide for supply trains navigating the treacherous passes between settlements. She never married, though, not for lack of suitors. The experience with Jed had taught her that independence was worth more than gold, and that a woman who could survive on her own terms was stronger than any man who tried to control her through fear. Her story had grown in the telling, spreading through the network of saloons, trading posts, and campfires that served as the frontier's informal communication system. Some versions had her wrestling the snake barehanded. Others claimed she'd used Indian magic learned from her father. All agreed that she'd proven herself tougher than the desert and meaner than any outlaw when cornered. Ada preferred the truth to the legend, but she understood the value of a fearsome reputation. Word that she'd outwitted and killed Jed Kincaid served as better protection than any gun keeping would-be predators at a respectful distance. She'd used her growing wealth to build a small school in Esperanza Wells, where she taught children the practical skills their parents often lacked: how to read animal sign, find water in the desert, treat snake bites and scorpion stings, and most importantly, how to think for themselves in a world that often rewarded conformity over survival. The final confirmation of her victory came on a scorching July morning, exactly 2 years after her escape. A drifter named Pete Cassidy rode into town with news that made Ada's blood run cold, then warm, with a satisfaction she'd never admit aloud. Found Jed Kincaid's body out in the desert, Pete announced to the crowd gathered in Murphy's saloon. Must have been there for nigh on 2 years, judging by the bones. Ada, sipping coffee at a corner table, kept her expression neutral as Pete continued his tale. Strangest thing, though. He was maybe 50 miles from where folks say he tangled with that Whitlow girl. Following a dry creek bed looked like searching for water that weren't there. Pete shook his head in wonder. Must have crawled the last few miles on his belly, his fingernails all torn up from digging at the sand. The saloon fell silent as men contemplated the image of the feared outlaw reduced to such desperation. But here's the real curiosity, Pete continued. Carved in the rock right beside where we found him scratched out with a belt knife were 3 words that don't make much sense. Ada's coffee cup paused halfway to her lips. "Oh, what did it say?" someone asked. Pete cleared his throat dramatically. "She beat me." Just that, she beat me. Like he wanted the whole world to know that some woman had gotten the better of Jed Kincaid. The saloon erupted in speculation and nervous laughter. Men who'd feared Kincaid's name for years found it hard to believe that their bogeyman had died alone in the desert, abandoned by his own men, and defeated by a schoolteacher half his size. Ada finished her coffee and quietly slipped out of the saloon. She walked to the edge of town, where the desert began its endless march toward the horizon, and allowed herself a small smile. Her father had been right about the desert showing mercy to those who respected its power. She'd learned to work with the land instead of against it, to turn its dangers into allies when survival demanded it. Jed Kincaid had seen the desert as just another tool for inflicting pain, never understanding that it demanded respect from predator and prey alike. The legend of Ada Whitlow and her battle with the diamondback rattlesnake became a cautionary tale told around campfires throughout the Southwest, a reminder that in the harsh country beyond the reach of law and civilization, survival belonged not to the strongest or the most ruthless, but to those wise enough to understand that the desert's greatest lesson was balance. And in Esperanza Wells, where children learn to read the signs of flash floods, and the approach of sandstorms, where women walk the streets without fear, and men settle disputes with words rather than gunplay, Ada Whitlow built a life that honored both her father's memory and the harsh beauty of the land that had shaped them both. The desert had tested her and found her worthy. Everything else was just a matter of living up to its expectations.